I'm Adélie Pojzman-Pontay, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as Ukraine fends off yet another overnight aerial bombardment, the first prisoners of war to come back since the latest rounds of peace talks arrive in Ukraine. Meanwhile, in London, we hear about NATO's Secretary-General Mark Rutte's speech at Chatham House. Finally, we have a chat with former Swedish Defence Minister Peter Hulqvist.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Tuesday, the 10th of June. 3 years and 107 days since the full-scale invasion began. I'm joined by Associate Defence Editor Dom Nicholls and Executive Editor for Audio, Francis Dearnley. As usual, let's start with the news from the front line. Dom, can you catch us up, please?
Yeah, hi Adélie. Hello everybody. So let's start in Ukraine and in one of the largest attacks on the capital, Kyiv, last night. It came under another massive Russian bombardment early this morning, overnight. Odessa was also hit with ballistic missiles and drones. There were deaths and injuries in both cities. President Zelensky said the attack on Kyiv was one of the largest on the city since the start of the full-scale invasion. Writing on Twitter, he said, Russian missile and Shahed strikes drown out the efforts of the United States and others around the world to force Russia into peace. For yet another night, instead of a ceasefire, there were massive strikes with Shahed drones, cruise and ballistic missiles. Now, the 5-hour-long attack in the capital hit 7 of the city's 10 districts, according to Vitaly Klitschko, the mayor. He said strikes had hit the Shevchenkivsky district, that's right in the centre, we've stayed there many times, while drone debris also fell on the grounds of a school in the Oblonsky district, that's a little bit further to the north. Now, our correspondent Memphis Barker, who you would have heard he dialed in yesterday live from Ukraine, he filed a report this morning in which he said, I could smell burning from my room and social media footage taken from rooftops showed clouds of smoke across the city. By 4:15 a.m. local time, the attacks appeared to die down after more than 2 hours of fairly constant assault. Whether there was further damage will become clearer in the coming hours, but already by 9 a.m. the city was back into its stride, the roads busy with people heading to work. Now, Ukraine's culture minister, Mykola Tochitsky, said that the St. Sophia Cathedral, right in the middle, right in the centre of Kyiv, was damaged. Writing on Facebook, he said, tonight the enemy struck again at the very heart of our identity. St. Sophia Cathedral in Kyiv, a centuries-old shrine symbolising the birth of our statehood, has been damaged. The St. Sophia Cathedral is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, dates back to the 11th century. It's said to be one of Ukraine's most significant religious and cultural landmarks. Then Timur Tkachenko, head of the Kyiv City Military Administration, said, today more than ever, it is necessary to be united. This night was difficult, but thanks to the incredible work of the Defence Forces, we managed to minimise casualties. A difficult day lies ahead, perhaps not one. It will take time to eliminate the consequences. And then down in Odessa, a maternity hospital was hit amongst other buildings. Local Governor Oli Kipa said the administrative building of an emergency medical station was completely destroyed. The facility director said that although 85 adults and 22 children had been inside at the time, no staff or patients were injured as everyone had got down into the shelter. Ukraine's Air Force said Russia launched 315 drones, as well as 2 North Korean KN-23 ballistic missiles and 5 Iskander-K cruise missiles, primarily targeting Kyiv. Air defences say they shot down all 7 missiles and 213 drones, with another 64 either coming down by EW or disappearing from radar, returning where they sent, or being lost but causing no damage. Now, these attacks come a day after Russia launched a record 499 aerial weapons against Ukraine, as Francis reported yesterday, and these are amid regular drone and missile attacks on civilian areas in recent weeks. The model seems to be Ukraine hits military airfields in Russia, and Russia fires back at civilian areas in Ukraine. Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary-General, said in a statement yesterday, "This deplorable act of political violence must be fully investigated and those responsible brought to justice." They are nice words, they are important words, but unfortunately they are nothing to do with Ukraine. He was condemning Saturday's attempted assassination of a presidential candidate in Colombia. Now, I checked this morning, there's been no word from the UN or Mr. Guterres on Russia's political violence or the continued actions that kill civilians. If only there was a commonly accepted word for deliberately using violence against civilians to further political aims. Now, maybe I'm being a bit unfair again to Mr. Guterres. He is, after all, very busy at the moment. He's in Nice on the French Riviera, speaking at the UN Ocean Conference. Now, I did check, and the last reference to Ukraine by Stefan Dujarric, who's the spokesperson for the UN Secretary-General, was last Thursday when, to be fair, he referenced attacks on hospitals, schools, kindergartens and residential buildings in Ukraine, albeit without once saying how these attacks had come about, as if these civilian buildings had just decided to blow themselves up. So although he didn't once say the word Russia, he did say the Food and Agriculture Organization, that's part of the UN, the Food and Agriculture Organization says that since 2022 it has supported 250,000 rural families across Ukraine with vegetable seeds, animal feed, cash and vouchers. So that's the last word from the UN about Ukraine. Thank you, Monsieur Dujarric. I suppose they could use the vouchers to mop up the blood, but, well, we'll see. Anyway, back to the attacks on Kyiv, and we were sent a short audio clip from a contact in the city who had to endure last night's strikes. It is very chilling. In the recording, you'll hear the engine's buzz captured in the final seconds before detonation. Now then, on the ground, the only movement to speak of is the continued Russian advance in the vicinity of Sumy, the city of Sumy. They moved about a kilometre yesterday. It further pressurises the Sumy-Suja road, the road that runs out of Sumy Oblast over the border into Russia towards the town of Suja. That road is not used very often at the moment, but it's still a major logistic route in the area. It means Russian forces are now about 20 kilometres north of Sumy city. Further down into the Donbass, there's still pressure in the vicinity of Kharkiv. That's about 30 km southwest of Pokrovsk. That's on the border of Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk oblasts. But Russian forces are not thought to be across the border yet. The US-based think tank Institute for the Study of War, they say geolocated footage published yesterday shows Russian forces operating in that area, and the Russian MOD also said yesterday that their central grouping of forces had seized more territory in unspecified areas of Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, but obviously they didn't provide any evidence for it. Russian mill bloggers are saying that elements of the 90th Tank Division of the 41st Combined Arms Army are engaged in the fighting there. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said yesterday Russia has begun an offensive into Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, quote, within the framework of the creation of a buffer zone in Ukraine. Now, interesting choice of words. Buffer zones sound nice and cuddly, and the phrase is obviously being used here because, as Francis said yesterday, Dnipropetrovsk Oblast is a new area where Russia, I think, is clearly trying to exploit recent battlefield successes. Up to now, you'll remember, in any so-called peace negotiations, Putin has only talked about claiming the 4 oblasts in the east plus Crimea. So he's not going to suddenly say now that all that was a load of rubbish and he wants the whole country, hence this talk of a buffer zone. And what on earth is a buffer zone? If missiles and drones can reach thousands of kilometres, how big a buffer zone do you need to feel secure? It's a rhetorical question. Clearly, Putin wants us to focus on this buffer zone narrative, not the fact that it's now weeks since he's ignored Trump's call for negotiations. I've said it before, I'll say it again. Is the Donald really falling for all this? I guess he is. Now then, further attempting to obscure what's really going on with yet more military word salad, Russia's first deputy chairperson of the State Duma Defence Committee, Alexei Zhurevlev, said yesterday that Dnipropetrovsk Oblast is now within the sphere of interests of the Russian military. What the hell does that mean? They're just trying to talk and not say we're shooting and killing people. They're just trying to kick the can down the road and keep Donald Trump on side. The ISW's continued assessment is that Russia's operations in this area is just a continuation of the ongoing offensive in southwestern Donetsk Oblast and is not the beginning of a new major offensive operation to seize territory in Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. So they are exploiting the success that they felt on the battlefield. I don't think there's any evidence really that this is the big summer push. Finally, for me, and just inside Russia, and Ukrainian overnight drone strikes forced a temporary suspension of flights in all airports serving Moscow and the country's second largest city of St. Petersburg last night. Russian Defence Ministry says it destroyed 102 Ukrainian drones overnight. They reported no damage, but they didn't say how many had been fired. Russia's Civil Aviation Authority, Rosaviatsia, temporarily halted flights at all 4 major airports serving Moscow and St. Petersburg's Pulkovo Airport, as well as other regional airports in 9 other cities. Flights in Moscow and some cities were restored by this morning, but restrictions were still in place in St. Petersburg as the working day got underway, and I've not seen an update from there since then. And that's us up to date, Adélie.
Thank you, Dom. We will go to Francis in a moment. He will be summarising the speech by Mark Rutte here in London, just so you know he didn't mince his words. But before that, I'd like to focus on the prisoner exchange that was promised during the latest round of talks in Istanbul about a week ago, and which began yesterday between Ukraine and Russia. So the exchange will continue for several days. That's from an announcement by Zelensky, and it includes prisoners who are wounded, severely wounded, as well as those under 25. Most of them were captured during the early days of 2022, so they have spent more than 3 years as prisoners of war. That includes some of the soldiers who defended Mariupol. The Ukrainian government didn't disclose the number of soldiers who came back for security reasons. Now, the exchange happened after yet another heated back and forth between the two countries, which delayed the exchange by a couple of days. Ukraine said it hadn't received the full list of POWs meant to come back, which was part of the spat. The BBC and Reuters have both reported from the scene of the exchange, so I'll summarise what's in both pieces. On Monday morning, the families gathered at the border with Belarus as the buses of soldiers came in. They were brandishing photographs of loved ones who had been taken prisoners. Few of them expected to be reunited, but they were all trying to gather any sort of information, whether it was about their brothers, fathers, sons, cousins, whether any of them had been seen by any of the soldiers, whether they may be coming back, wounded, ill, alive, or amongst the 12,000 bodies that are also being repatriated as part of the agreement with Russia. As the soldiers came down the buses, they were smiling, but they were also gaunt and with completely shaven heads. The families cried names of regiments, hoping for any information. There was also a video released by Ukrainian authorities which shows a soldier shouting, "Hi mum, I've arrived, I'm home," in a cell phone that had been handed to him by an official. Petro Yatsenko, Ukraine's coordination HQ for prisoners of war, told the BBC that the soldiers had spent a lot of time in Russian places of detention without any visits from the International Red Cross, and that their health conditions were very poor, that they had not had sufficient food, and that they will need a long period of rehabilitation. Aside from that, I'd like to talk about another report from the BBC that retraces the struggles of families of civilians that were taken prisoners since the beginning of the war and that are not included in any of the negotiations so far. The piece, I think it's an interesting counterweight to the prisoners of war who have been brought back, focuses on Tatiana Popovich, who only found out her son was alive when another prisoner had been released, and phoned her to tell her son was in a prison in Kursk, at least in May 2022. Since then, she's received a couple of letters, both written in Russian, saying he was well taken care of and well fed. They were very short. And she's knocked at every door to find information about him and how to bring him back, without any success so far. She's been campaigning with the daughter of another captured civilian for the release of civilians in general who are being held in Russia, and they've created an organization. What she says in the piece is, the only thing they said is that Trump is interested in the issue of deported children and that maybe civilians could somehow fit into that category. But they're actually different categories that can't be combined. The piece goes at length on the efforts from the families and how little progress and how few answers they're getting back from any of the authorities. And I think it's a really interesting subject to bring into the light, because obviously the return of prisoners of war is essential and is a key part of the negotiations, but there are some other elements that are left out. The piece also recounted a quote from Dmytro Lubinets, the country's human rights ombudsman, which showed little optimism or clarity from the Ukrainian authorities on that subject. He said, "I do not see the real effective approach to returning the civilian detainees to Ukraine. We do not have a legal basis or the mechanisms for returning them." I will link to both of these stories in the show notes. A couple of other political and diplomatic updates from me before we turn to Francis. Orban yesterday gave an interview with the French TV station LCI, where he said that Europe, I quote, must be strengthened in the long term and there must be a strategic agreement with Russia. He also added that the sanctions against Russia are destroying Hungary and the whole of Europe. It's very much aligned with the rest of Orban's position and regime, which is very Kremlin-friendly and has become the most Kremlin-friendly state in the EU. Budapest has been blocking the opening of EU accessions for Ukraine and has obstructed in recent weeks after Ukraine's security service said it had uncovered a Hungarian spy network in western Ukraine. As we've talked about previously in this podcast, there's an ongoing referendum in Hungary about Ukraine's accession to the EU. The poll opened in March and is going on until June 20th and has been criticized for manipulative questions, encouraged citizens to reject Ukraine's accession. Final point for me is that Canada will reach NATO's defence spending target of 2% of GDP this year, which is 5 years ahead of schedule. That's from Prime Minister Mark Carney yesterday. Just to put it in context with the recent announcements in the SDR here, the UK's defence spending should go up to 3%, according to the SDR, by 2034, which is 9 years from now. And comparatively to the rest of Europe, Germany is at 1.9% of defence spending compared to the rest of its GDP, and France is at 2.1%. Carney's announcement comes just ahead of the NATO Leaders Summit in late June, where member states are expected to commit to higher defence spending threshold up to 5%. The Prime Minister said that Canada would support a new NATO defence industrial pledge and participate in the EU's Rearm Europe initiative. He added that future cooperation with the EU will be a major theme of the upcoming Canada and EU summit. So we will be watching out for that. And now turning to Francis. Francis, you were at Chatham House yesterday listening to Mark Rutte's speech. Can you tell us more about what happened yesterday?
Sure. Well, thanks, Adélie. As you say, we were talking about NATO a moment ago, and it was interesting hearing NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte giving his speech, setting the scene prior to the major summit at the end of this month. It was a crowded room. The session was being streamed live to the world press, but the atmosphere was rather relaxed. Rutte, lest we forget, was previously Prime Minister of the Netherlands for 14 years, and so has plenty of experience in these kind of settings and was comfortable to take questions without notes after his speech, including two from the Telegraph, one from me and one from our defence editor, Danielle Sheridan. The speech was laying out his plan for a better NATO, and he started by thanking the British contribution since the organisation's foundation, scattering references to Churchill throughout, then said his ambition was to make NATO stronger, fairer and more lethal. A deliberately strong word. Because of Russia, war has returned to Europe, he said. Its war machine is speeding up, not slowing down. Russia produces in 3 months what NATO produces in a year. Adding, Russia could be ready to use force against NATO within 5 years. And in the questions section later, he was even blunter. Russia is on a total war footing. He went on, "We are all on the front line. Because of the missiles, the distance of cities can be measured in minutes. The home front and the front line are no longer separate. History has taught us that to preserve peace, we must prepare for war. Hope is not a strategy." So it's punchy stuff, but delivered, as I say, with a kind of reassured confidence. Many of these arguments have been made before, of course, and it was obvious Rutte wasn't seeking to conjure despair or panic, but a sense of things are bad, but we've got this. It's for others to determine whether we have or not. He then said that all NATO allies will reach 2% of GDP on defence spending this year, but at the NATO summit in The Hague, he would underscore that moving forward, 5% would be expected. "The danger will not disappear even when the war in Ukraine ends," he said, calling then for a 400% increase in the air shield, millions more artillery shells and many more tanks, warships and aircraft, plus drones and long-range strike systems. He also talked about investment in cyber attacks and sabotage countermeasures. Interestingly, he was keen to stress that cheap drones can take out expensive tanks, but later on in the Q&A said that while drones are important, quote, "any general will tell you that ammunition stockpiles are key." Then, as expected, he turned to the role of the United States. He was frank. "America has carried too much of the burden for too long," he said. "President Putin does not act as if he wants peace, and we support Trump's efforts." Later adding that the president broke the deadlock, which was important for bringing the Russians to the table. He then said that a just and lasting peace in Ukraine was essential. He ended by stressing what he said at the start, that NATO is strong and that Article 5 means we will defend from any direction. "We are deadly serious, and if anyone tries to attack us, the response will be devastating." Then came the questions, where he expanded on a few of these themes. When asked about which country was the graver threat to NATO long-term, Russia or China, he replied, "Russia is the long-term threat, but NATO was created to face wider threats than just the Soviet Union." When pressed on the implications of a US withdrawal, he said he was not worried because it will be gradual and Europe has the power. He stressed that everyone I speak to in the US totally understands that for US homeland security, a secure Europe is crucial. Then I was chosen to ask my question, which I phrased in a way that I thought might give him an opportunity to comment on Trump's personality and his risk threshold for Ukrainian attacks deep inside Russia. Thank you, Secretary General Francis Dearnley, The Telegraph. An American outlet this morning that's describing Trump's reaction to the deep strikes on Russian territory by the Ukrainian drones as being badass. I wonder what your reaction was to that, and whether you agree with Kyiv that to end this war, it's going to require additional long-range strikes into Russia to take out its industrial capacity.
But to end this war, we need Putin to come to the negotiating table and not with this historian who is now popping up in Istanbul twice and again telling us about the history of Russia and Ukraine from whatever the 12th century, I don't know, but plus. And constantly restating what the state already in 2022, you need a Russia which is serious, wants to negotiate, and the war. And to get there, it all, I think, starts, of course, with keeping Ukraine strong in the fight. But also we need what President Trump has been doing, breaking the deadlock with Putin, starting that now. I really think it starts from there. And when it comes to what happened Sunday a week ago, let's not forget what the Ukrainians were doing was taking out capabilities of the Russia to hit innocent civilians in Ukrainian cities and communities, going about their daily lives, not being in the military, just normal, average citizens, as we are sitting here in this room, being under the threat of the Russian capabilities. And in a very innovative way, they managed to a certain extent, and we don't know exactly what the extent is, but of course it had a considerable impact, it seems.
Shortly afterwards, Danielle asked her question about how he thought European populations should pay for the increase in defence spending. Should politicians be raising taxes? His answer to this, I thought, was the most interesting he gave. He said he'd been warned about rattling the public with some of his pronouncements. They should be rattled, he said. If you do not go to 5%, including the 3.5% for direct defence spending, you could still have the National Health Service, the pension system, but you better learn to speak Russian. That's the consequence. So pretty full on. Now, to be fair to Mr. Rutte, I think he was talking more in a metaphorical sense there, that if you're unwilling to pay for defence, then you have to accept greater Russian influence over your affairs. But nonetheless, he knew the words he used. And indeed, that is the headline that many have picked up today, including us. The world we thought we were entering after the end of the Berlin Wall is gone, he concluded towards the end. A common refrain now, but still a stark admission of just how much has changed these past 3 years. So that was the event, which lasted about 45 minutes or so, and which gives a clear sense of what we can expect at the NATO summit in a couple of weeks. A demand for much higher defence spending, punchier rhetoric and a reinstatement of Article 5, and stark warnings about the nature of the increasing threat. He refused to confirm whether Ukrainian representatives would be invited to the summit this time. It's rumoured the Americans are hesitant to allow it, but did affirm that Ukraine's path towards membership was irreversible. My biggest takeaway, though, was his continued praising of Trump for his approach towards the war, and more broadly, clearly he knows that keeping the Americans on board is essential. But it's still quite something to hear a NATO Secretary General in essence celebrating the fact that Trump and Putin have regular phone calls. He may not have a choice, but even so, it is symbolic, I think.
Thank you, Francis. Our colleague from Battle Lines, Venetia Rainey, interviewed Swedish politician and former Defence Minister Peter Hulqvist on her recent trip to Gotland.
Thank you for making time for us.
Pleasure to meet you.
You're one of the few senior European politicians that's been clear-eyed about the threat posed by Russia from very early on. Can you explain the early experiences that shaped those views?
I have always had a view that Russia is or can be a problem because Russia and former Soviet Union is an authoritarian society. We cannot compare Russia with Europe, and we cannot from European values, positions, reform Russia. Russia, it is what it is. And from my point of view, I think we must accept that. And because of that, I think that we must support Ukraine with everything we can. This is not only their wars, it's our war. The support for Ukraine is now the most important thing, because the result of that war, it will also define the position of Europe in the future. So this is between authoritarianism or democracy. So my view is that we must upgrade the support to Ukraine in every dimension, and I don't think that the Russians are serious around so-called negotiations.
But can you tell me a bit more about your personal experiences as a child growing up on the Finnish border, how those views have been shaped, why you feel that so strongly?
I think my mother is from Finland, and I also visited Finland a lot when I was growing up. The people in these areas of Finland, they had the war experience, and they had the experience that the Russians was a real threat towards Finnish democracy, Finnish freedom, and Finland had also paid a very high price to survive as a democracy. So there was a very negative view about what Soviet Union was at that time. So I think that maybe that have also created an impact on me. I have never been so impressed about former Soviet Union and Russia, and if we see to Russian history, it has always been about authoritarianism and trying to expand land area and have also a huge level of influence in their so-called neighborhood. And they have an ambition to dominate over other countries. And we must also remember that the Warsaw Pact was something that Soviet Union, they were the main power of that.
I'm speaking to you on Gotland Island. Do you think it was a mistake for Sweden to close the Gotland regiment in 2005?
I think it was a mistake to close many regiments and also to reduce the civilian and military defense in that level. That was the result of it. So it was hard to start again when it was necessary, and it's a huge ambition to build it up again. It takes time. It's delivery of weapon systems. It's creating new units. It was reactivating conscription service. So this is a very huge project that we now are working with, and we are not finished. We must do more.
You oversaw a lot of that. After Russia's invasion of Crimea, you brought in conscription here, you sent troops back to Gotland, you pushed for rearmament, you deepened defence ties with various allies. Why weren't you able to get Sweden to join NATO? What was the resistance to that while you were defence minister?
It was necessary to do it because that Russia shows that we cannot rely on them in no dimension. Our strategy, both from Finland and Sweden, was that we were in a position that we will show that we see the threat from Russia. We will invest in national capabilities, build the national capabilities up, and at the same time we wanted to deepen the cooperation with other countries. I think I signed around 20 defense agreements, and we had some very important defense agreements with United States, and we also have with United Kingdom. But when they attacked Ukraine in the way they did, there was no alternative because we couldn't rely on them in anything. So when they took that step...
You mean in 2022?
Yes. When they took that step, it was nothing to discuss. After a while, it was some sort of hesitation, and we searched after what should we do in this situation. But both Finland and Sweden was in the end, we agreed upon to apply for NATO membership.
And how has being a member of NATO bolstered Sweden's defences?
Yeah, we are in the alliance now, and we are together with others, and maybe it's a little bit a shaky situation in NATO after that. We have the new administration in the United States, and that is something we need to handle. But if we are together, we are safer than if we are alone.
Do you think Europe could defend itself without the US?
I think that the US have signed so many agreements with European countries, and also have very clear commitments inside NATO, and they have to deliver what they have signed. So I think that they must stand up for what we have been united around.
How is Russia as an enemy different to fight today than it was during the Cold War?
I don't know if they are different in their psychological behavior or thinking. I can only see that they are doing this now. And during the Cold War, the Western Europe and United States, we built deterrence, high level of military capability to deter them from doing anything. And I think that we have to do like that also in the future. This will not be a question of a decade or something. This will maybe be a question of a generation. But we must be successful in Ukraine. I have visited Ukraine before the big war, when we have the low-intensive war, often after 2014. But I've also been there after they have attacked 2022 in February. And it's very clear that they want to be a Western country. They want to be a democracy, a sovereign state. That is what the people there want. They do not want to go back to Russia. So I think from that perspective, that's a very strong argument for supporting them. But if Russia will be successful, we will have Russia closer to us. That will be a big problem. And I also see that there is a risk in the future for Russian troops at the Baltic border, at the Finnish border, and maybe they will try to test NATO also. So we must have a very clear and realistic perspective of what Russians can do in the long perspective.
Yeah, there was a report recently in Swedish broadcaster SVT, wasn't there, about satellite pictures of a build-up on the Russian side of the Finnish border. What did you make of that?
Yeah, I see that as a realistic situation in the future. They try to build infrastructure just now, and if there will be a ceasefire or something in Ukraine, and they feel that there is a possibility to move troops from there, maybe they can move them to the Baltic borders or the Finnish borders.
On Ukraine, what more do you think Sweden should be doing to support? Should they be sending the Gripen fighter jets?
That is a complicated question, because it also has to do what other countries are ready to do. United States are, for example, very keen on to send F-16 to Ukraine. So it's a question of what will happen in this international air coalition. We have said that we are ready from our side to send Gripen, but it's more complicated than that. Then I think that I think we have a decision around 18 packages to Ukraine. It's very also qualified weapon systems, and it's a lot of ammunitions. We will continue with that, but the most important question just now, I think, is to invest in new production line in European defence industry and upgrade the capabilities and capacity so we can deliver weapon and ammunition on a regular basis, because we need also to have something in our storages, and we need also that we must have the possibility to defend ourselves. So I think that we must think about this balance. And I think each nation and also European Union as an organization now have a responsibility to invest in defense industry. This is also an industrial war.
And just finally, what about Swedish troops on the ground? The foreign minister said she wouldn't rule it out.
I think it's too early to talk about these sort of things, because in these so-called negotiations they also talk about, are we going to send European troops there? We have no agreement about nothing. There is nothing signed. We don't know the circumstances. We don't know anything more than had been in headlines in the press. And I think it's too early to discuss this sort of question before we have seen something. Things happened when it goes so fast. So we do some people do things that are positive for the Russian side. For example, when United States says that we can recognize Russia in Crimea, Ukraine do not accept that, and it's to give gifts to Putin very fast. And I think that that is not what we should not act like that. It must be a smarter way to handle the Russians and negotiate than promise them different sort of things in a very early stage. And we have seen nothing about signed agreements or results of anything.
And that's aimed at Donald Trump, right? So you think he's not an active partner for peace? He's not supporting European interests?
We need to have a strong transatlantic link, and we really want to have a close connection to the United States. And we have signed so many agreements with the United States about that. And I'm very glad that we have American troops now in these exercises on Gotland Island, and I will continue with that. I started a process with all these things with the defense ministers in United States. Ashton Carter, Bob Work, Mark Esper, General Mattis, that sort of people. And we did a lot together, and I will continue with that. And we've also signed our defense cooperation agreement, and I think that is something also very positive. So I'm not against any cooperation with the United States, but we cannot from US or other countries play the cards in a way so Putin think he is a successor in some sort of process. So I don't rely on the Russian side's willingness to do something in reality. I think they want to continue this war, and I think they want to weakening Europe and the transatlantic link. But we must act in a way so that not will be the result of all this.
So let's turn to our final thoughts. Dom, do you want to start?
Yes, thank you, Adélie, and thank you also to listener Steve. I forget where you wrote from, Steve, so apologies for that. But Steve said, I'm curious about Ukraine's decision to be so open about how the operation was carried out. This is Spider's Web, the drones attacking those airfields deep inside Russia. He says, does it make strategic sense to reveal those details to the enemy, especially if the methods or technologies used could be applied again in the future? What might be the reasons behind such transparency in this case? Well, thanks, Steve. I think... This is my, from the mind of Marge, this is my view. It's one thing to know about the methods and the technology, but it is quite another step, quite a big step to be able to operationalise them, which is a horrible word, big clunky word, so I'm sorry about that. But what I mean is turning them into a workable solution. I understand the methods and the technology, but even if you gave me and Francis the rest of the week off, we wouldn't be able to come up with anything quite that impressive.
Speak for yourself.
I mean, just think about the logistics required. Just think about just getting the stuff nearby on those trucks, the time, distance, fuel calculations, all that kind of stuff, smuggling in the component parts, all of it wrapped in this veil of secrecy. So I think that is very impressive to be able to do that, to be able to roll this thing out, even if you have the technology and the methodology of knowing how these things are going to fly off and strike their targets. Then think about the power of the media. I mean, the stunning images that we all saw at the time, and we've continued to see later. There was that film, was it yesterday or the day before? The SBU put out a drone's eye view of actually launching from the top of one of the trucks and then going and landing on a Tu-22, I think it was, but one of the big Tupolev bombers. So, amazing imagery. And think about all the audiences that's going to receive this imagery. Think about the audiences in Russia. You've got the Kremlin. You've got the Russian MOD, you've got the Russian public, all the Russian logistics system, and the security forces who, I've not seen any reports in the last couple of days, but certainly in the immediate aftermath of that attack on Sunday, they were having to stop all the as many trucks as they could to search and have a quick look to make sure there wasn't going to be a follow-up attack, and even a quick look on every single flatbed truck going into or moving around Russia. That just grinds everything to a halt. Other audiences, the domestic Ukrainian audience in society and the armed forces. We know, we were in Odessa at the time. We've reported what the effect on morale was there. It was absolutely immense in Ukraine. And then you've got the international audience. So this shows Ukraine's capability. It shows their ingenuity. It shows proportionality, which is very important. Contrast Spider's Web, attacking military sites, with the last 2 days of Russian strikes on civilian targets across Ukraine. It also underlines how Ukraine has had to go for the archer and not the arrow. Now, that might be a better thing to do anyway, to destroy these things before they can get in the air. Arguably, it's harder, but it might be the better thing to do. But it also puts the focus on, yet again, why they're having to do it. And that takes us back to the question about air defence and how and why the US might provide more air defence or even allow Ukraine to buy more air defence. And it also puts the focus on the wider military support, which is kind of Europe and the money. We keep hearing that European NATO has an economy 17 times out of Russia. It's like, okay, we'll do something with the money then. So there's a load of different audiences, a load of different messages being passed here. So yes, whilst it might say on the face of it, hey lads in the Kremlin, why don't you get a load of lorries, shove a load of drones in them and fly them off to attack sites in Kyiv? Just having that idea, and I don't think I'm spilling any state secrets there, they've probably already had that thought themselves. But it's one thing to think about it. It is a huge step to then being able to actually roll this out. So I think, Steve, absolutely correct to ask the question, but I think overall, for the impact on all those lenses, I think they absolutely had to get the message out as far and wide as they could. But thanks for writing in.
Thank you, Dom. Francis and I both have final thoughts related to history and looking back to the Second World War, so I will start with mine, and then Francis, you can have the last word. That story I recounted in the update about the Ukrainian prisoners of war coming back to meet their families, and especially the many families holding photographs and posters and signs, looking out for any information, reminded me of a very vivid scene in French history, which is 80 years ago, actually right now, between April and August 1945, came all the people who had been deported to concentration camp came back to Paris, helped by the Red Cross. And a lot of them, the vast majority of them, I believe, were brought back to a very, very fancy hotel in the centre of Paris that had been requisitioned by the Red Cross for the war and was the headquarters. It's called the Rutte. It's a very fancy hotel. You can still go there and have a coffee or a glass of wine in a very nice and fancy area of Paris. The survivors from the concentration camp were brought back to this hotel, cared for, looked after. Some didn't make it. A lot of them died shortly after being liberated. And the Red Cross had put all of the list of the people who had come back or who had died in transit on the walls of the hotel, and families from all over Paris and the area, and I imagine from other places in France for those who could make the journey, were gathered at the hotel looking, feverishly at the list, looking for any information about their loved ones who had disappeared in the last 6 years. And asking any of the survivors they could get their hands onto, any Red Cross workers they could get their hand onto, for any information about whether they'd seen someone in a camp several years ago, coming from this place, coming from that place. It's always being talked about as this frantic meeting place for all of the families who were just, a lot of them who had just come out of hiding, because a lot of them were Jewish, and coming out of hiding at the end of the war to look for their loved ones. And so the scenes that were in the BBC pieces very much reminded me of that, and very much reminded me of the different parallels between history and different moments in time that we're able to draw. And similarly, the same panic and hope that families have when it comes to their loved ones coming back, and the ramifications that will have for these families many, many years and many generations down the line, because that sort of trauma doesn't stop with the person who was taken captive. And if you're more interested in that story about the Lutetia, there's a very poignant scene in a French novel that's been translated into English. It's called The Postcard by Anne Berest. I will put the name of it in the show notes. It's a very beautiful, beautiful book about surviving the war as a French Jew. And now, Francis, for your final thoughts.
Well, thanks very much, Adélie. Sticking with the theme of the Second World War, Friday, of course, was the 6th of June, D-Day, and we made reference to it on the day on the podcast. I just wanted to thank everybody who's written in, particularly from the United States and Canada, reflecting on the significance of that date, many of you sharing family memories of those who landed on the beaches 81 years ago. Now, of course, the Supreme Allied Commander was Dwight D. Eisenhower, who went on to be President of the United States. And I want to thank Albert for writing in and saying that one of his students likes to review US presidential inauguration speeches. Below is a paragraph from Eisenhower's 1957 inauguration that we're currently looking at. It looks like it was written for current circumstances in Ukraine. And here is a quote from that speech. "We seek peace, knowing that peace is the climate of freedom. And now, as in no other age, we seek it because we have been warned by the power of modern weapons that peace may be the only climate possible for human life itself. Yet this peace we seek cannot be born of fear alone. It must be rooted in the lives of nations. There must be justice, sensed and shared by all peoples. For without justice, the world can know only a tense and unstable truce. There must be law, steadily invoked and respected by all nations. For without law, the world promises only such meagre justice as the pity of the strong upon the weak. But the law of which we speak, comprehending the values of freedom, affirms the equality of all nations, great and small." And Albert asks, another lesson from recent history. Indeed. And thank you very much, Albert, for writing in, and for everybody who contributes every day.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and in those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest newsletter. Each week, Dom Nicholls and Francis Dearnley answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights. Plus, maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the description to this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app, and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each day on X Spaces. Follow the Telegraph so you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Phil Atkins. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells and David Knowles.
My name is David Knowles. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.